So I've done a few close readings of the language and speech of conservative politicians within the last few months. I perhaps have focused on Mitch McConnell and particularly the politics of subject positions in speech acts and who is allowed to speak for, particularly who is allowed to speak for abstract entities such as the United States that encloses numerous positionalities, but the right to speak for it, is masked in these universalist terms. And so to say Americans don't need this without identifying which Americans one is specifically speaking for is extremely problematic. And I have argued that the reason that critical tools such as analysis of race, and particularly across history, is essential to the survival of democracy in the United States. And recently I put up a piece of a fully clothed image of myself taking a picture as a kind of artificial selfie in the reflection of a window that had been protected with metal barring. And it was removed, and the justification for the removal was that it violated a sex and nudity policy, even though there was neither any sex nor nudity in it, nor any sex nor nudity referenced in the verbal commentary that I had provided for the piece, which was in some ways a sort of political satire using space-time travel directed at the way that immigration policy has shifted in the United States, and that under this neo-fascist movement that inspired the Trump presidency and individuals that are associated with Homeland Security, such as Chad Wolf, these policies of imprisonment have really escalated, and policies of deportation, policies of exclusion, and that the implicit argument in the piece is that if the democracy of the United States, which has always been an immigrant nation since the founding of the nation by immigrants, that if these policies continue to escalate, then they'll, of course, be applied to the citizenship of the United States itself, and in some instances, particularly in instances of people of color, Native Americans, Mexican Americans, Chinese Americans, Korean Americans, Japanese Americans, African Americans. This is already being done. So I thought that it was interesting that the justification for the removal of the piece seemed to have a trajectory that had nothing to do with the point. One of the things that interested me, though, was the language. So I don't really know, to be perfectly honest, how YouTube determines whether someone is nude or not. Obviously, they didn't determine very well in this instance, or what sex is, since they really missed the mark. So I don't really know if this is an AI that does this, if it's some kind of algorithm that is designed to perceive nudity or perceive sexuality, or if it's actually someone looking at the piece. Now, in any case, whether it's one or the other or something else, this pronoun we is used. So we wanted. So again, this universal position, whatever form, letter, entity generated this particular text, whether it had anything to do with an individual actually looking at the piece, or whether it's just a further application of a program, I have no idea. But a we is used, and we wanted to let you is me in this instance, know our team reviewed your content and we think it violates our sex and nudity policy. We know you may not have realized this was a violation of our policies. So we're applying a strike. We're not applying a strike to your channel. However, we have removed the following content from YouTube. And so I had put a new version of the piece that was removed up following the removal, and I had changed the title to a completely clothed and entirely asexual, as well as essentially metaphorical and largely abstract, etc., 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 to signify that that the initial removal had been a mistake. Now, obviously, the program or form letter or whoever is speaking for the we entirely missed the irony here, right? So again, creating this confusion about who we are and whether we actually have a reasonable amount of intelligence to determine whether something violates a policy or not. And I wasn't convinced that we did have a reasonable amount of intelligence, or I wouldn't have received this kind of a notification following my ironic retitling. So, that having been said, I petitioned the removal, and then following the petition of the removal, they reinstated the original, and then they reinstated the retitled piece, but still no nod or gesture of appreciation of the irony of the change, which may or may not point to the fact that it's entirely likely that even the retraction had nothing to do with an individual analysis of the work. So I thought it was interesting too, sort of pretend not an apology, right, but this sort of pretend appreciation. Thanks for your patience while we reviewed this appeal, which I'm honestly, I'm not even entirely convinced that it was reviewed, but our goal is to make sure content doesn't violate our community guidelines. Well, so there's so much content, in particular, like, okay, another thing that's I found really ironic was following this, like my page was littered with Fox News, side headers, right? So, which I find so incredibly appalling and offensive that it's like an assault every time I see one of these things. And you can mark them and you can say not interested, but they continue to show up, and you have to be logged in for any of that preference to make any difference. So as many times as you click, violation of policy on this Fox News stuff, it continues to show up. Why does it continue to show up? Because it makes them money. So in all honesty, their goal is not in any way to make sure that we don't violate the community guidelines, but their goal is to make money, by any means, necessary and possible. The strategy here, though, was interesting to me, because the more that one encounters obstacles, the less that likely it is for one to use a service. So you could say that whatever determined the misdirection whether it was an AI or whether it was a complaint by someone, it amounts to a form of harassment, right? That you constantly have to like defend your work, right? So I was thinking about this in terms of, we and who is allowed to speak and the politics of all of that. And I was also thinking about it in terms of the way that strategies of harassment also participate in this kind of, universalizing subjectivity, right? Like our standards, like these sort of moral majority Jerry Falwell standards. And if you have standards, like I particularly think that it's offensive, right, in my positionality, that we have all of these Fox News neo-fascists telling us and littering us with this like malignant hatred of everything that doesn't in some way refer back to some kind of element of this archaic notion of the moral justification of capitalist, adventurist, colonialist white male privilege, and this malignant patriarchy that it produces ad nauseum, that really, that takes a toll on a lot of us and produces trauma. And yet, that's not part of the community guidelines. In terms of the malignancy of hate speech, none of that is ever questioned. That's part of our rights of free speech, right? But everything else, including taking a selfie in a reflection, is considered morally questionable. So this right to determine moral guidelines, this sort of Jerry Falwell moral majority, which is anything but moral and anything but the majority, and that we see like increasing intensity in the neo-fascizing of the Christian right, that is a form of being able to use this we, whereas many of us in different positionalities are not allowed to say we. So Mitch McConnell, for example, is allowed to say, we Americans don't need critical race theory, but someone like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is not allowed to say, we Americans do need critical race theory, because she, as a woman and as a person of color, like doesn't occupy this privileged positionality to use this we. And this all of what I'm saying is both the truth and like very much part of why we need to be critical of these kinds of universalizing subject positions. We're always already performing the political, and then when we're not allowed to call attention to it and say that no, there's a law in place that you can't call attention to the way that these subject positions are being deployed to take away your rights, that's political. In fact, that's oppressively and suppressively political. There's a word for it. It's called fascism. And then to just say that everything else, demanding the right to say these things and to have a critical apparatus to be able to say these things is political, but not utilizing and deploying against people in suppressed positionalities, this apparatus is ridiculous. So anyway, I was seeing the parallels here, and I thought of another parallel because of the apology. Thanks for your patience. So patience suggests that the only thing that was hurt in all of this was time, right? It took time to get it back up. So I was thinking about how this works. Oh, thanks for your patience, but through the proper channels, and because we have this apparatus in place where you can petition it or you can challenge it, then all that really was lost is your time. So I thought about this in terms of like voter suppression, right? So any challenge now, this is part of many of the states that have produced these voter suppression acts, including the one that I'm in now, Arizona, right? Arizona, Texas, Georgia, Florida, and other states have all come out with state-sponsored legislation that makes it difficult for people of color and Native Americans to vote, to participate in the democracy that is their right. And I was thinking about how some of these bills and laws simply create the ability to put an obstacle in the way. And then even though you may have the right to petition, all that's really lost, right, is your time. Thanks for your patience in this voting misunderstanding. And we appreciate that, you followed the proper channels and petitioned, and it turns out that you, in fact, did have, you did fill out the paperwork properly, and you do have the right to vote. In the meanwhile, voting takes place in time, right? It takes place in time and space. That's why HR 1 is so important, because it's hard for people to move around in space if they don't have resources. If you're not a space-time traveler, then you have to move, using a vehicle, a car, or your feet. And if you live in a place where it has been zoned such that it makes it difficult for you to get to the polls, then your access is, in effect, does become a suppression of your ability to vote. And this is all to the point. So it takes place in space, and this is why we need things like HR 1, and it takes place in time, which means that if something like this, we're sorry, that we misinterpreted your ballot as being invalid, but, we're going to reinstate your voting rights. Well, you missed that election, right? So all that really has to happen is that a mistake is made at the right time, every time you vote. And then, you have the right to appeal. But this kind of harassment effectively bars your ability to vote. It's not patience. It's that because we exist in time and space, that it is an issue. Time isn't conceived of as substantial, but it's extraordinarily substantial if it involves producing a work, or it involves performing an act that is dependent on time, which voting certainly is. No one's going to count your vote after the fact if you vote after, right, the specified voting date, either in a presidential election or in a state election or even in a local election. So it's not about patience. It's about intruding upon intruding upon spatial and temporal aspects of the act of voting, right? It's all about organizing the space and time of your right to vote. And then you can say, sure, there are means, to petition it, and in that subtlety, in an abstract sense, your rights may be reinstated, but effectively, and materially, it's irrelevant, entirely irrelevant, because the time has already elapsed, right? And we missed our vote. So if this was removed, and this was a vote, and it was removed, even for a brief amount of time, patience really would have had nothing to do with it. It didn't count. So how this affects your channel? Well, I've discussed analogously how it affects your channel if your channel is the right to vote, right? To make this right, your content has been reinstated. All right, so let's say that my particular ballot was pulled, and it looked like something was fishy, and then it was analyzed, and it wasn't. It took a while, to investigate all of this. So I didn't get to vote in that election. But to make it right, we've reinstated your ability to vote, and your ballot will be counted next time. Well, maybe, unless they pull it again, right? So, analogously, the apology and the form of the appeal, is very similar to the way that things work on a larger scale in the United States. And it's not even necessarily that all of the laws say if you're this, that, and the other, then we're going to take away your rights. But mechanisms have been put in place. And like I said, what if it isn't an AI, right? What if it's one of those offensive Fox channel individuals or teams that make the complaints, or one of these Jerry Falwell flunkies that make the complaints and don't bother to really understand what all the ramifications are, or perhaps know what all of the ramifications are, right? And so that would be, again, a form of harassment that the law enables. And I think this is a key issue. To make it right, to make it truly right, you have to create a system in which the rules and the ability to apply those rules don't enable harassment, don't enable bullying, don't enable oppression, and don't enable the suppression of democracy and the true freedom of speech. And in order to do that, you either have to change your algorithm, or you have to be much more careful about what you remove, and perhaps make consequences, for removing things that shouldn't be removed. That, for example, trying to take away the rights of Americans to vote in a democratic system and organization of government should perhaps be a crime against America. It should be considered a treason performed against American democracy, and there should be consequences for that kind of act.